Welcome back, seekers of truth. Tonight we step into the heart of Northern Europe, to a land often seen as calm, safe, and untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Finland. Endless forests, thousands of lakes reflecting the midnight sun. A country many imagine as secure and unshaken, where crime feels like a distant shadow. Yet hidden among those lakes lies a mystery so brutal and unresolved that it continues to haunt the nation more than 6 decades later. This is the story of the Lake Bodom murders, a crime that shattered the illusion of safety, scarred a generation, and remains one of the most chilling unsolved cases in European criminal history. To understand the weight of this story, it helps to picture the place itself. Finland, a country of contrasts. Long winters, endless nights, and then summers where darkness hardly comes at all. Nature dominates every aspect of life. The forests stretch for miles, and the lakes are everywhere. They offer fishing, swimming, and a sense of freedom. Lake Bodom lies near Espoo, only a short drive from Helsinki. Today, the area looks peaceful, surrounded by trees, calm water, and small peninsulas stretching into the lake. In the 1960s, it was no different. To teenagers seeking a weekend escape, it was the perfect setting. Safe, remote but not isolated, close enough to the city, yet far enough to feel like an adventure. Finland in 1960 was a society still healing from the scars of war. The country had survived brutal battles during World War II, caught between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Yet in the years after, Finland projected stability. For young people, life was beginning to feel freer, more modern. Motorbikes, music, and summer trips by the lake were part of that new world. Against this backdrop, a small group of friends prepared for a weekend that should have been ordinary. But what happened at Lake Bodom in June 1960 would make the place infamous. The story begins with 4 teenagers, 2 couples. 15-year-old Mila Emeli Björklund and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. They were joined by another couple, 15-year-old Anja Tuulikki-Maki and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Seppo Antero Boisman. The girls knew each other from vocational school, while the boys were apprentices at a foundry. They decided to spend the weekend camping together by Lake Bodom, on a small peninsula called Högnäs. They arrived on Saturday, June 4th, riding mopeds along the lakeshore. With them they carried supplies, a single large tent, and the simple excitement of a summer outing. That afternoon they set up camp. They swam in the lake, fished, and relaxed as the long Nordic evening stretched ahead. The boys shared some drinks, nothing unusual for Finland, where vodka was as common as fishing rods at a campsite. By nightfall, the teenagers had settled into their tent, but as later discovered, the night would not pass quietly. We know from Mila's diary that the group did not sleep straight away. Her brief entry noted, 5th day, camping at Lake Bodom. Seppo and Nisa were drunk. At 2 a.m, Seppo was fishing. It seems the boys could not fall asleep and tried a bit of late-night fishing under the moonlight. Afterward, they returned to the tent. It must have been a calm, even joyful moment. The still surface of the water, the silver light across the forest, and the small group of friends settling into sleep. But by dawn, the campsite had become a scene of horror. The morning of June 4th, 1960, arrived in southern Finland, with quiet stillness. The early light spread across the shores of Lake Bodom, a place that only hours earlier had echoed with laughter, whispered conversations, and the sound of restless fishing lines cast into the water. By 11 a.m., the silence was broken not by the campers themselves, but by those who happened upon their sight. Esko Johansson, a local man, had taken his son down to the lake for a swim. What should have been an ordinary Sunday outing became a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. From a distance, Johansson noticed a collapsed tent, its pale canvas oddly darkened in patches. Curious, he drew closer. The realization struck with an intensity he would later struggle to put into words. The tent was soaked through with blood. Inside and around the collapsed structure lay the bodies of 3 teenagers. 15-year-old girls Mila Emeli Bjorklund and Anja Tuulikki-Mäki, and 18-year-old Seppo Antero Boisman. Near them was another boy, also 18. He was badly injured, his face and head disfigured by strikes so severe that cerebrospinal fluid leaked from his nose. Yet against all odds, he was still alive. His name was Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. Johansson and his son ran back toward town to call the police, their morning swim forgotten. While they were gone, another man, Siegfried Siggy Velasma, stumbled upon the same grim scene and made his own urgent call for help. The survivor, Gustafsson, was rushed to a hospital in Helsinki, unconscious, with fractures to his jaw and skull. His injuries were devastating, and for weeks his condition remained uncertain. Medical staff feared permanent brain damage. He would eventually recover, but his memories of the night were fragmentary, fragile, and later controversial. The tent told a chaotic story. Its supporting lines had been cut, causing it to collapse on the sleeping teenagers. Through the fabric, an attacker had stabbed and struck at them, trapping them inside. When investigators later examined the bodies, they found a combination of blunt force trauma and stabbing wounds. Mila Bjorklund had endured the worst of it. She bore at least 15 stab wounds, many inflicted after she was already dead. Evidence suggested sexual violence, though the details remained disputed. Seppo Boisman's injuries centered on his neck, and he likely died of blood inhalation. Anja Mäki carried defensive wounds on her arms, suggesting she fought back before succumbing. Nils Gustafsson was left disfigured but alive. Theories about why he alone survived would later form the heart of heated debate, casting suspicion first on shadowy figures, then eventually on him. Personal belongings were missing. The campers' wallets and motorcycle keys had been taken, along with some clothing. Gustafsson's shoes turned up later, nearly half a kilometre from the tent. The murder weapons, believed to be a knife and a blunt rock, were never found. Investigators managed to establish a narrow time frame. The killings likely occurred between 4 and 6 a.m. during the brief Finnish summer night. 2 boys, birdwatching that morning, reported seeing a blonde man walking away from the campsite around 6 a.m. They assumed he was simply another camper. A fisherman's son also mentioned seeing a blonde stranger near the area, though he heard no commotion. Gustafsson, once awake in the hospital, added his own recollection. Through hypnosis, a method police then considered valid, he described a blonde man dressed in black who peered into the tent through a cut in the fabric. Instead of opening the flap, this man had severed the ropes and attacked from outside. The description was vague but consistent with what others had seen. A police sketch was made. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, with a sharp jawline and swept-back blonde hair. It was a lead, though hardly a solid one. What happened next would shape the entire case for decades, and not for the better. When police arrived, they failed to secure the scene. No perimeter was established, and no tape was set. Dozens of officers, soldiers, curious locals, and even journalists trampled across the site, contaminating potential evidence. Items were moved, footprints were destroyed, and any chance of reconstructing the attack with clarity was lost almost instantly. Among the few pieces of physical evidence recovered was a pillowcase near the tent, wrapped with an elastic band. It contained blood and semen, though early testing methods could not link it conclusively to any of the victims. A discarded bottle was also pulled from the lake, bearing 2 fingerprints. Whether it belonged to the killer or simply a careless visitor remained uncertain. The Finnish army joined the search, combing the woods and dragging the lake. Yet the weapons, the missing belongings, and any conclusive trace of the attacker were never found. In the following days, the scale of the investigation ballooned. Police interviewed more than 4,000 people. Roadblocks were set up, sweeping through the countryside northwest of Helsinki. Incredibly, 88 fugitives and wanted criminals were discovered during this effort, but none of them could be tied to the Lake Bodom murders. This was the beginning of a mystery that, more than 60 years later, remains unsolved. The nation would learn the names of eccentric suspects, from a kiosk owner who hated campers to a German immigrant rumoured to be a former Nazi and even a spy. And eventually, suspicion would turn to the only person who walked away alive. When a crime is this brutal and seemingly motiveless, investigators naturally turn their focus to the unusual figures on the edges of society. In the case of Lake Bodom, several names emerged, some almost immediately, others decades later. Each carried a story that could, at least in theory, connect them to the murders. Pauli Kustaa-Luoma. The first lead came almost by accident. On the morning after the killings, a carpenter living in the forest encountered a dishevelled man. Dust-covered and visibly shaken, Pauli Kustaa-Luoma asked for a cigarette. His arms and chest bore red stains that looked very much like blood. It seemed, for a brief moment, as though the case might be solved instantly. But appearances were misleading. Luoma was an escapee from a labour facility with a history of theft, but not of violence. Investigators quickly learned that his alibi placed him far from the campsite during the murders. The blood on his body was his own, the result of his chaotic flight through the woods. Luoma was guilty of being a fugitive, but not of the Lake Bodom killings. Pentti Soininen. If Luoma was not the man, could the killer have been another escapee? Finland in the early 1960s harboured more than a few troubled young men drifting beyond the reach of authority. One such figure was Pentti Soininen, only 15 years old when he fled from a care home. At the time of the murders, he was a petty criminal. Later, his life spiralled into repeated violence, earning him a diagnosis of psychopathy. Years later, police questioned him about his whereabouts on the night of June 4th, but there was no evidence tying him to Lake Bodom. His history was disturbing, but his connection to the murders was tenuous at best. Soininen was ruled out. Valdemar Gyllström, the kiosk man. The most infamous local suspect was a man whose name would become synonymous with menace in the region. Valdemar Gyllström, better known as the kiosk man. He owned a small kiosk in Oita, not far from Lake Bodom. To the townspeople, he was notorious. A violent alcoholic, Gyllström routinely beat his wife and children. More chillingly, he harboured an open hatred of campers. Visitors to the woods near his home reported being pelted with rocks. Some found razor blades hidden in apples left at campsites. Others returned from a swim to find their guy ropes cut. Gyllström's campaign of harassment seemed almost ritualistic. When the teenagers were murdered in a tent whose ropes had been sliced, suspicion naturally turned to him. Police searched his property, but they found nothing conclusive. What made the case stranger was that shortly after the murders, Gyllström filled in a well on his land. Years later, his son-in-law claimed that the missing belongings of the victims might have been buried there. But the well was never reopened. His wife initially provided him an alibi, saying he had been home on the night of the killings. Decades later, she admitted that she had lied under threat. He had told her plainly that if she denied him an alibi, he would kill her. In 1969, Valdemar Gyllström walked into Lake Bodom and drowned himself. His death only deepened suspicion. Some acquaintances later recalled drunken confessions in which he admitted to the murders. But official investigators dismissed them as the ramblings of a disturbed man. To this day, many Finns believe that the kiosk man finally acted on his hatred of campers. Hans Assmann. If Gyllström embodied the image of a local menace, Hans Assmann represented something altogether different. A shadow figure woven into the geopolitics of the Cold War. Assmann was a German immigrant living in Espoo, only a short distance from Lake Bodom. His reputation was darker than that of any ordinary eccentric. Rumours swirled that he had been a guard at Auschwitz during World War II. He had, in fact, served in the Luftwaffe and later spent time in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. Some believed that during this captivity he was recruited by the KGB. Whether or not he was a spy, his behaviour after the murders was deeply suspicious. On June 6th, only 2 days after the killings, Assmann arrived at Helsinki General Hospital. His clothes were stained with what looked like blood. Dirt was under his fingernails. He acted erratically, feigning unconsciousness and lashing out at medical staff. The attending doctor, Jorma Palo, was convinced that the man before him matched the police sketch of the blonde stranger. He called the police. But investigators accepted Assmann's alibi, that he had spent the night in Helsinki with a woman. Her landlord supported the claim, yet even that story raised questions. The timeline of his supposed breakfast alibi left hours unaccounted for. And why, if the stains on his clothes were merely paint as he insisted, did they so clearly resemble blood? Police never tested the clothing, which Palo himself later admitted to secretly keeping for decades. Assmann remained a person of interest in other unsolved cases as well, including the murder of a teenage girl and the deaths of 2 young campers. He was violent, he was unpredictable, and he was feared. In 1997, he died. On his deathbed, he told a journalist, "I will not admit nor deny things." He never confessed, but he never cleared his name. To many, the ambiguity was almost as damning as an admission. A haunting photograph from the victim's funeral shows a blonde man with sharp features in the crowd. Some believe it is Assmann himself, silently watching as the community mourned the very teenagers he may have killed. For decades, suspicion focused on outsiders. But in 2004, a shocking development reframed the entire case. Police arrested Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor, and charged him with the murders of his friends. The case against him rested on forensic analysis of his shoes, found far from the tent. Modern testing revealed the blood of all 3 victims on them, but not his own. Prosecutors argued that this indicated he had worn the shoes during the killings. They suggested a narrative. Gustafsson, drunk and frustrated after a quarrel, had been ejected from the tent. Humiliated, he returned armed with a knife and rock, cut the guy ropes, and launched a frenzy of violence. After killing his friends, he injured himself to stage an attack. Then he disposed of belongings to simulate a robbery and collapsed, pretending to be another victim. Witnesses claimed he had confessed over the years, One investigator recalled a vague admission, and a woman said she had overheard him boasting about escaping justice. But the defense countered forcefully. Gustafsson's injuries were catastrophic: a fractured jaw, cracked skull, and cerebrospinal fluid leaking from his nose. Could someone so gravely wounded overpower 3 others and sustain such deception? Medical experts testified that the injuries were genuine and life-threatening. Blood evidence inside the tent also complicated the prosecution's case. Gustafsson's blood was found among the victims, suggesting he too had been attacked while inside. His other clothing showed none of the blood patterns expected of a killer in such a frenzy. After a long trial in 2005, the jury acquitted him. He was awarded compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, though the stigma of suspicion never fully disappeared. This gallery of suspects, fugitives, local tyrants, and alleged spies, left the Finnish public with more questions than answers. Each figure could, in theory, fit the shadow of the blonde man. Each left behind fragments of motive and opportunity, and yet none could be tied to the murders with certainty. By 2004, nearly half a century had passed since the summer morning when bodies were discovered at Lake Bodom. For most, the case had become a grim legend. For Nils Gustafsson, it had become the shadow of his entire adult life. Then, suddenly, it returned, not as memory, but as accusation. Police informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of his 3 friends. The news stunned Finland. How could the lone survivor, long pitied as a victim, now be cast as the perpetrator? The prosecution's theory rested heavily on forensic science unavailable in 1960. The shoes found 500 meters from the campsite had been retested with modern methods. They carried the blood of the victims, but not of Gustafsson himself. To investigators, this was proof. The killer had worn those shoes. The narrative they presented was lurid. On the night of June 4th, Nils had grown belligerent after drinking. He quarrelled with Mila, who rejected his advances, and Seppo, who intervened. Seppo, stronger, beat Nils badly, breaking his jaw and leaving him humiliated. Consumed by rage, prosecutors claimed, Nils later returned with a knife and a rock. He cut the tent ropes, collapsing the fabric onto his friends, and unleashed a savage attack. Seppo and Anya were killed quickly. Mila suffered most, stabbed repeatedly, even after death, and left partially unclothed in what prosecutors described as a crime of passion. Afterward, Nils attempted to stage a burglary. He removed wallets, watches, and motorcycle keys. He walked away to hide them, no one knows where, since they were never recovered. He discarded his shoes in the woods, then returned shoeless to collapse beside the tent. His earlier injuries, inflicted by Seppo, helped sell the illusion that he too had been attacked. It was a compelling story on paper, but in court, the defense dismantled it piece by piece. First, the injuries. Photographs from 1960 showed Nils bandaged, his face swollen, one eye sealed shut. Doctors testified that his fractures and blood loss were severe enough to risk death. Could a teenager so gravely wounded wield a knife and bludgeon 3 others? Could he walk half a kilometre to discard shoes, then return to feign unconsciousness? Medical experts doubted it. Second, the blood evidence. Gustafsson's own blood was found inside the tent, mixed with that of the victims. This indicated he was attacked within the same confined space. If he had been the aggressor, why would his blood be there? His other clothing bore no spray patterns typical of someone standing over victims during frenzied stabbing. Third, the psychology. If Nils had truly committed a triple murder, why lie down beside his girlfriend's mutilated body, waiting calmly to be discovered? Would a teenage killer of passion also be a master of deception? The jury listened for weeks as experts debated bloodstains, footprints, and medical records. Witnesses recalled ambiguous remarks Nils had made in the past, but none amounted to a confession. In October 2005, the verdict came. Not guilty. The acquittal was decisive. Nils Gustafsson walked free, later receiving nearly €45,000 in compensation for wrongful imprisonment. For him, the ruling ended a nightmare. For Finland, it reopened an old wound. If not him, then who? The acquittal left the case unsolved once again, and speculation reignited. To this day, 4 main theories dominate discussion. 1. The kiosk man. Valdemar Yielström, the violent kiosk owner, fits the profile of a man who hated campers enough to lash out. His later suicide in Lake Bodom itself only fuels suspicion. His wife's eventual admission that she had lied about his alibi under threat strengthens the case against him. Yet, without physical evidence, police never charged him. 2. Hans Assmann, the German expatriate, remains the most haunting suspect. He matched eyewitness descriptions. He arrived at a hospital with blood-stained clothing days after the murders. He had a violent history and possible ties to intelligence services. Even his deathbed comments were ambiguous, neither admitting nor denying guilt. Many Finns believe he was shielded from investigation because of alleged connections to the KGB. 3. Nils Gustafsson. Though acquitted, some still suspect the survivor. The bloody shoes remain a puzzling detail. Prosecutors insisted that only the killer could have worn them. Supporters of this theory believe Nils managed a cover-up, fueled by alcohol, rage, and humiliation. Detractors argue his injuries make this impossible. 4. An unknown stranger. Perhaps the blonde man reported by birdwatchers and fishermen was neither Yielström nor Assmann, but someone else entirely. A drifter, a fugitive, or a nameless local who slipped back into anonymity. If so, his identity has vanished into history. 65 years later, the Lake Bodom murders remain Finland's most enduring mystery. The crime scene was compromised before it could be studied. The murder weapons were never found. Witness descriptions remain uncertain. Every suspect carries doubt alongside suspicion. The victims, Mila Björklund, Seppo Boisman, and Anja Mäki, are remembered less for their lives than for their brutal deaths. And Nils Gustafsson, once seen as a victim, later accused as a killer, and finally acquitted, lived the rest of his life under the shadow of suspicion. The midnight sun still shines over Lake Bodom each summer. To many, its glow recalls not warmth but unease. Somewhere in the silence of those waters may still lie the knife or rock that ended 3 young lives. Perhaps the truth, like the midnight sun, will never fully set nor rise. Thank you all again for listening. I'll see you in the next one. I love you all, and good night.